diversity of themes and so on. I was sort of cringing when somebody was making a critical observation of saying, was it you? I forget who it was, that you have human, oh no, it was Rajiv Malhotra, that we have human rights and development and poverty and so on. Okay, I can see putting it, but what is this?
He doesn't understand common good.
What is this common good coming into the picture and so on? Well, I have a confession to make. This was, and it's going to explain the title of this session. That's why I'm introducing it this way. When I was discussing with the Vice Chancellor, organizing a conference jointly between my program on human rights and development at Harvard and the Human Rights Center and the School of Government and Public Policy here, he wanted to do the theme that he and I have collaborated on over the years of some dimensions of human rights and development, and he threw poverty, and then he added this common good thing. And I said, well, that's a hodgepodge of concepts that don't make much sense. And then I tried to make sense out of it. And then what is interesting, and I said this at the opening, but I want to repeat it. It's too bad that Rajiv was called to the ministry and won't be able to stay this afternoon. But the reality is that the ancient Greek concept of common good does relate to what benefits all. And that is a fundamental concept of virtue in the concept of Greek philosophy. And it has its versions in a variety of philosophy. I'm sure in ancient Vedic texts and so on, there's the equivalent of that. But what struck me, and I don't know that Raj realized it when he plugged that term in there and we strung the terms together, is that the common good potentially is a translation of the extremely ambitious wording of the Sustainable Development Goals, leave no one behind. And that struck me, since that's kind of an underlying moral principle of the whole enterprise of defining Sustainable Development Goals to be achieved between now and the year 2030, that leaving no one behind is a clumsier way of saying what is captured by the concept of the common good. Is everything that we're going to do something that will benefit everyone? So we're going to improve consumption patterns, we're going to improve health, we're going to improve all of these things. All of these things are worth improving. And we have a goal number 11, which is on equality as well.
Goal 10. Goal 10.
Goal 10 and 11. 11 is on equality, I think.
11 is
cities.
11 is on cities. Oh, goodness. Thank you. All right, 10 is on equality. And so that's the way...
Is patterns of consumption and
production.
Right. So that's why I thought that, well, maybe there's some value in having all this terminology. And then it occurred to me that if the Sustainable Development Goals, embracing human rights, human development, poverty reduction and elimination, are to become part of a common good that actually changes people's lives, what really is essential in that is public policy. And so that's why the title of this session is Public Policy Perspectives on Integrating Poverty Reduction, Human Rights, and Development. Because in the previous 3 sessions, we've had enough exchanges of saying there are ways in which we think differently, we think the same, we have similar goals, we have different goals, we're adopting common goals, and so on. But the underlying potential for this to affect people's lives is whether or not public policy can find the ways and means of making this part of the lived reality of the people under the system of public policy that is governance. So that's what I was hoping this session would address. Now, we have 3 very distinguished speakers, and it may save a lot of time if I don't spend much time making introductions. Let me just say a brief word about all 3, and then we can take them one after the other. Our first speaker is going to be Professor Armin Rosencrantz, who's well known around here. His degrees are from Princeton and Stanford, where he got a JD, an MA, and a PhD, and he founded an international environmental NGO called Pacific environment. And he has taught courses all over the world, published numerous leading books, while here he's taught environment-related topics and had the wonderful, we all admire him for this, he's engaged students, and I'm looking out to the students here as well, engaged students in research with him and regularly co-publishes with students. Dr. Suraj Kumar is a truly knowledgeable person on the subject of human development. He worked for nearly 15 years in the UN on design and implementation of the Program on Governance, which is an area where Dean Sudarshan has also made his mark in the governance component of UNDP's work. And he has worked in India and South Asia for UNDP as well, and had a role in, or played a significant role in the Madhya Pradesh Human Development Report. And as we know, one of the ways of bringing these policy considerations to the ground to touching people are local human development reports. And so he has direct experience in that. Dr. Indranil is a professor in the School of Government and Public Policy, assistant professor, and he has degrees, MA, MPhil, and PhD from JNU, and is a researcher dealing with health economics, and has been a research scientist and assistant professor and Wellcome Trust postdoctoral fellow at the Health Economics and Financing Unit at the Public Health Foundation of India. And that his research there also relates to ecosystems and that sort of issue that will enrich our discussion. So I will be able now to give the floor successively to each of our speakers, thank them very warmly for being here, and Armin Rosencrantz, you now have the floor.
Well, one of the themes here is no one left behind. The one group that is clearly being left behind are the tribals, forest dwellers, and local people, local rural people who have this land. And typically what happens is the government, using the power of eminent domain, seizes the land and then typically gives it to corporations. That's the modus operandi. There is something called the Forest Rights Act of 2006. Now, for many years, no one ever heard of it. It was, the Forest Rights Act of 2006 was in, what should we call it, in abeyance or essentially an obsolescence for 7 years. 2013, the case of Vedanta came forward, and the Indian Supreme Court decided to look at that case. It had done so earlier and gone in favor of Vedanta. Vedanta is it's also called the Sterlite Mining Company. I think it's originally in the UK, but its desire was to take the Niyamgiri Hills and mine it for bauxite. Bauxite is the precursor of aluminum. So they wanted to take that bauxite from public land, essentially privatize the public land, and make it into aluminum. State of Orissa was very supportive of this, and most of the, to the extent that any public officials were involved, they all supported it. Basically, eminent domain, take the land, give it to the corporations. This is the way we practice. So, Supreme Court of India looked at this, a complicated case, because in addition to the obvious seizure of the land, there was also a religious issue, because the top of the Niyamgiri Hills, all this bauxite, was supposedly inhabited by the god of a small community, Dangra.
Dongriya Kond.
Dongriya Kond.
Dongriya.
Dongar is hill and Kond is the Kond tribe that inhabits.
Good. Okay. So these people said, our God is at the top of these hills. You can't take it from us. Supreme Court of India, notwithstanding its inclination to support the corporations, and as they always had done, suddenly decided, well, the argument came that we have this Forest Rights Act of 2006, which had been, basically left in obscurity for 7 years. Some of the advocates said, Forest Rights Act of 2006 is unique because it requires that people involved in giving up their land have to do so in a referendum, the first of its kind, I think, in the world. An environmental referendum has to be taken by the Gram Sabhas in the community. And so they did this referendum, and it was unanimous, essentially unanimous, in favor of the locals and the tribals and the forest dwellers. So what is the Supreme Court of India going to do? You have a law that has been essentially in obscurity for 7 years, but which is passed by Parliament and which has this unique requirement of a referendum and the participation, the local participation of the Gram Sabhas. And we have this participation theme that we've explored earlier in the day. Supreme Court of India, notwithstanding its typical inclination, decided, okay, we are going to support the Forest Rights Act of 2006. It's a law. It applies directly here, and it requires a referendum. And the referendum has been taken, and the referendum came to the conclusion that the locals deserve the land and it shouldn't be taken away from them. So they came out with this ruling that it's called the Vedanta case. I've written about it if you're interested. That Forest Rights Act of 2006 should be revitalized and should be used in this case. There's a kind of a strange development that a law that essentially has been in obscurity for 7 years is suddenly brought up, and the main element of it is this unique referendum. I don't know of any other referendum, environmental referendum, that's ever taken place. So we have the locals, the tribals, the forest dwellers gaining the support of the Supreme Court of India. It's the only case of the Supreme Court, only mining case that resulted in this very pro-tribal, pro-forest dwellers result. And I think that Supreme Court of India, I don't know if it's going to follow this ever again. This is now almost 5 years ago. It may not continue this. The other mining cases tend to be a mixed bag, but typically go in favor of the miners. Here, for the first time, Vedanta is neutralized, and the state of Orissa is upset. The state of Orissa has already suffered an earlier reverse in the POSCO case. POSCO is the largest steel company, one of the largest steel company, if not the largest steel company in the world, South Korea. And Prime Minister Singh went to South Korea and promised the president of South Korea that he would guarantee that POSCO could prevail. And it involved not only taking of local land, but building a rail and equipping a port, none of which was supported by local people, but nonetheless, that was going to happen. Suddenly, Jairam Ramesh, the then Minister of the Environment, said, no, I don't think this is a good idea. First of all, it doesn't have all the approvals, the consent decrees. We need to at least go back and get the approvals and the local participation in the process of environmental impact assessment. You have to have local participation. And Prime Minister said, you know, Ramesh, you are dealing here with large interests. This is going to bring a huge amount of money to ERISA, tax revenues, employment. Why should you stand against it just on the basis of a few approvals that haven't been met? Jairam Ramesh sort of hems and haws. Finally, the Prime Minister of the time, Manmohan Singh, said, I'll give you a promotion if you relent on your disapproval here. So eventually, Jairam Ramesh relented, got promoted, member of the cabinet now, used to be Minister of the Environment. Minister of the Environment is not a member of the cabinet, became Minister of, I think, Roads and Transport. And he's now a major figure, although he's not in the parlor, he's in the Rajya Sabha, but he seems to be a major figure in the Congress party. So, so POSCO is gone, actually withdrew its whole original proposal, went back to South Korea. Ramesh got a promotion. The people at least won in the sense that they didn't have to give up their land and help develop a port and a rail. And then the Vedanta case, nail in the coffin, at least for that moment. I'm not sure that Vedanta is going to be a landmark case in Supreme Court mining history. But as of now, Vedanta is the law, which means that local people have to decide with a referendum supporting by the Gram Sabhas whether to give up their land. And typically, these people are not oblivious to their own interests, so they're going to say, yes, we want the land. We don't want to give it up to some private corporations, whether indigenous or from abroad. Among other things, I have concluded that the Ministry of Environment really should be called the Ministry of Development, because it's not really committed to environmental protection, it's committed to economic development. I talked to a whole number of senior people at the Ministry of the Environment. They all said our main goal is economic development.
It would be true of all ministries, that an artisanal ministry is not committed to economic development.
What is it?
I said that would be true of almost every ministry you go and talk to.
Right.
Sorry, my apologies.
How could you resist?
The last point I want to make is that I believe that in many countries of the world, and certainly including the United States, and I think including India, there is what could be called the belligerency community. These are people who run the the country. They consist of the energy industry, the transport industry, it's cars, rail, airplanes, the defense industry, the aerospace industry. All these people, numbering much less than 1% of the population, run the world, and certainly run the United States, and I believe run India. Small community, very unusual to identify them, but I'm calling them the belligerency community, the elite who make all the decisions, and everybody else somehow, without recognizing their existence, goes along with the decisions made. So no one left behind. Locals, tribals, forest dwellers are all left behind, and now with the possibility of the Vedanta and POSCO cases setting a new tone, it's possible that they will now come forward, not being left behind, take advantage of the rights given to them by the Forest Rights Act of 2006, and begin to assert it again and again. That's what needs to happen. Environmental advocates, forest dwelling advocates are talking about it. Whether it will happen or not, we have to see. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Just add a footnote to what Armin,
Yes, of course.
because of the emphasis on participation, there was also a reference to the 73rd and the 74th Constitutional Amendment and Gram Sabhas. Many years before Vedanta and the case, DuPont wanted to build a big factory in Goa, and they procured all the permissions, the state government of Goa, the government of India, and so on, and they acquired the land also, and they built a big fence around the land, they built a wall demarcating the location of the factory. And they're about to start constructing this factory when a few of the panchayats in whose jurisdiction this land came, three of them, got together and said, sorry, the law requires that there should be a no objection certificate from the panchayat, and we've not given one. And so there was a big debate within Goa as to whether you should have the wonderful jobs and move on, or whether people should care about the environment and the pristine qualities of Goa. And lo and behold, I mean, every other place, these no objection certificates were acquired with just a telephone call. Somebody in the district administration would make a call, the secretary to the Gram Sabha would study and produce a piece of paper which indicated that there was no objection, and that would be placed in the file. It didn't happen this time, and it won out, so DuPont couldn't build a factory. But that didn't make much difference in the sense that DuPont then went to Tamil Nadu, and in Tamil Nadu the old procedure was followed. Tamil Nadu has always not been very sympathetic to local government and local voices, and so the authority of the Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu to extract a no objection certificate was well intact. It somewhat broke down in Goa. That's just a footnote to the point you made, that is, that if you got some empowerment and participation of the people and you listen to them, then outcomes would be different, and we haven't yet got to a situation where we can be certain that that happens.
Thank you.
So we're confronting head-on the role of the public sector in dealing with private investment, and especially in the extractive industries, and the overlapping issue of tribes and other populations. So I'm sure let's get some questions from the other panelists, and then I wanted to ask students who may have had internships in locations where these issues have been addressed head-on to share your experience with us. I know that there are plenty of students at this university who have had such internships. I hope some of them are in the room. But you wanted to speak first. Please go ahead.
I think there is a sort of, the socialist hypocritical streak in all of us that makes us go for DuPont and even Vedanta, whereas we'll never go for Coal India, Nalco, and so on and so forth. So I think if we are looking at the tragic record, the tragic environmental record of India, It has nothing to do, with all due respect, with post-1991 globalization. It may have kind of added some elements to it, but it is certainly a fact that the 2006 Forest Rights Act, and I don't think it was shelved, but for it to percolate, because most of these acts are formulated, there is some consultation in Delhi, and scholars from universities and various places are called. I can assure you, no Dongriya Kond was called for the consultation on the Forest Rights Act. So given the fact that, the distance between the metropolis and the Mufassal is a few light years in our country, we should not be surprised. So I don't think the word obsolescence or being on the shelf is the most appropriate. Fact of the matter is that today the Forest Rights Act is part of the discourse in local governance because it is part of the local power politics. Not so much only because every Gram Sabha meeting, what is a Gram Sabha? It consists of the entire adult population of the village. Okay, so people who are in the electoral role, they are members of the Gram Sabha. It is supposed to have at least 3 meetings, sometimes you have special Gram Sabha. In the case of Vedanta, special Gram Sabha was called. They said, look, because bauxite, unlike coal, is not at the slope of the hill, it's on the top of the hill. If you take the bauxite out, the water will run out and therefore the place will become desert very quickly. A guy called Felix Padel, I'm sure Sudarshan knows it, he's supposed to be some descendant of Charles Darwin, who works with the Dongriya Konds, has pointed out to this particular feature, that sometimes when we focus on Vedanta, we stop focusing on where the game is playing the other place. The same environment minister who would stand in the way of ArcelorMittal would sanction the same project to Abhijit Industries. So please understand, there are no good guys and bad guys as far as ministries and ministers are concerned. To get back to the basic point, extractive sector hardly adds to local employment, except for some local people being hired as help in the houses of the project staff, and of course the violation of local women by again the project staff and government officials.
Very little local benefit.
Yeah, so the circle between household and economy is not completed in the case of extractive sector. Having said that, I'm going to talk a little bit about sustainable development, which is a topic for tomorrow, but since I worked on the HDRs, which is a precursor to sustainable development, let me add my 2 bits worth. Joan Robinson used to say that India is such a large country that whatever is true, the opposite is also true. So with that caveat, I would like to put forth that today this whole conversation on sustainable development is on everybody's sort of lips. There is a company called Pernod Ricard that manufactures liquor. Is also holding conferences on sustainable development goals. I suppose the booze will be free at the conference. But bottom line is that unlike the MDGs, I think there is a very strong normative core to the sustainable development agenda. This is my view. I am not a scholar on human rights or on human development. But MDGs you could achieve by any means. You can improve your literacy rate by getting the illiterate population killed off. Literacy rate will go up. That's the logic of an economist or a dictator. I couldn't resist that dig at my friend Sudarshan. But on a more serious note, I would say that given the fact that there is a specific sustainable development goal on inequality, which is goal 10, there is a specific goal on sustainable consumption and production, which is goal 12. Given the fact that there is a specific focus on peace, justice and strengthening governance, with a strong emphasis on democratic governance, which is goal 16, and strengthening the means of implementation, which is goal 17, I would say that I don't know how it works in theory, but in practice, it is possible to use the SDG agenda to move forward the human rights, human development, and the Sustainable Development Agenda in lockstep. I have a presentation that we can dispense with, but just to say that if you want to,
You only have 5 slides, please show it.
Yes, please,
Okay.
please, go ahead.
Okay.
We've got plenty of time,
okay,
an hour.
Well, you not loaded it.
it's loaded.
It's
It's
loaded there, yeah, it's
top,
not
top, bottom right.
That one.
Uh-huh.
Oh, very good.
Go to the second slide. Title is off.
You've got a remote.
Right left.
No, the other way, yes.
Okay. So this is about interconnectedness. MDGs, the UN agencies fought amongst themselves to get their goals and their indicators in. Okay, including one particular UN agencies with which I had the privilege of working, saying we actually don't believe in MDGs, we believe only in the Beijing Platform of Action, BPFA. So on the other hand, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, it's all about interconnectedness. Okay, the word for all and harmony of nature, okay, is used in all of the 5 elements: people, planet, peace, prosperity and partnership. So it is the interconnectedness which is to many an normatively appealing aspect. It's no longer about my goal, my target, my department, my action and so on and so forth. Can we, I'm sorry. And of course, sustainable development is the latest avatar of the HDR. And as the first HDR had it, there are 4 pillars: equity, efficiency, participation, sustainability. So very clearly the fit between the pillars of human development and the logic of sustainable development, which is the 2030 agenda, is quite good. Anyway, this is just to say that there are sort of aspects of human development, and I apologize for the small font, but there are directly bearing on sustainability and growth, which is got to do with education, health and livelihoods, and those that improve the world, those that create conditions for human development, which has got to do with political participation, which has got to do with environmental sustainability, human security and human rights, and promoting equity and social justice. So the top 4, which is long and healthy life, knowledge and decent standard of living, directly enhance human capabilities, and the bottom 4 they create the conditions for further human development. And the normative aspect I have mentioned is already quite strong, so a lot of it is actually taken from the Enlarged Freedom Report. Okay, now let me talk a bit about the Indian experience of the SDGs in contrast to the MDGs. There was very strong local or national ownership for the SDGs. I recall that the UN Special Rapporteur on MDGs was made to go back from the Planning Commission building back to the airport, because the government of India said, we have signed the Millennium Declaration, we don't know about these MDGs, would you please take the next flight back? That was, I think, Evelyn Lovelin's aborted visit to influence policy in India. On the other hand, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, India was very much part of it. The Prime Minister was there, and he endorsed the the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, and the ownership is quite strong. So the question to ask, what happened? Okay, and at the risk of sort of appreciating Sudarshan and myself, a lot of it happened because of India's experience with the State Human Development Reports. Unlike the MDGs, the State Human Development Reports were not driven by the United Nations. The first one, with of course strong support and solidarity, was Madhya Pradesh, and since then there are 23 State Human Development Reports.
Sandeep Dikshit and Suraj did that.
That was a long time back. And of course, the headquarters hated it because we insisted on government ownership. HDRO thought we were promoting government propaganda. One leading official of the HDRO compared India to Syria, and so on and so forth. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's good to, the good thing about UNDP country in those days was that there was a certain amount of insulation that was provided from the sort of misbegotten directives from headquarters. So we've done 23 states. More important, because the credo was always that the exercise should be people friendly and not paper friendly. So we invested heavily in follow-up, in building capacity, in advocacy, in raising political will, and therefore from analysis to action, which is a phrase coined by Sri R. Sudarshan, had been a very strong credo for India. And it is because of that practical intent and intensive engagement with stakeholders at various levels that not only was it a great learning opportunity for sort of inexperienced fellows like myself, but it also provided a stronger sense of ownership of the idea of human development at various levels of governance in India. Okay, Narendra Modi used to come to state plan meetings in the Planning Commission and talk about the Gujarat Human Development Report. Now you can say that the guy is a mass murderer, which he is, but the fact of the matter is that when the Chief Minister of a state, okay, takes the responsibility, okay, to ensure that planning, budgeting, implementation and monitoring are informed by the canons of human development, it's a good thing. There are states with many more democratic chief ministers that never did so. So the fact of the matter is that SDGs, because of the good experience with state HDRs, and of course, I mean, the World Bank did their number and everybody did their thing, but today sustainable development goals are percolating at all levels of India's federal structure. But the point to be made is that while SDGs are important, SD is more important. We can meet the goals without the situation on the ground having changed. Because, you give a format, it gets filled up. Anyone who's worked in the UN will tell you how these things are done very well. Can we go next? Okay. So the imperatives. So this is standard macro, meso, micro level, that sustainable development goals also involve conversations within the enabling environment of national and state policies. Since we talked about extractive sector, I'll give you an example of one state, Chhattisgarh. It is rich in mineral resources and in forest resources. And if you talk to most well-meaning bureaucrat, they'll say our biggest curse is that we've got 42% forest and 32% tribal population, because it gives us limited leeway for expanding projects with regard to economic development. That's a view. I'm not saying it's a correct view, it's a view. And when you talk to those guys, you have to take that view into account. Now, Chhattisgarh it's one of India's major power producing states. Okay, we produce 4,200 megawatts. We have signed PPAs for about 12,000 megawatts. We are able to sell, because of the economic slowdown for the past 4 years, only 3,600 megawatts. Now, where does Chhattisgarh produce its energy from? From coal. Now, technically, if we want to be sustainable development oriented, we should do away with our coal-fired thermal power plants. Now, which means that you need to start decommissioning. Now, decommissioning means there must be an investment to compensate the state for shutting down those power plants. Today, those conversations need to happen. At COP23, India has said very clearly, we are not going to shut down our power plants, we are going to invest in clean coal, regardless of the cost. So the point is that there have to be some conversations with regard to how do you graduate away from fossil fuel towards renewable energy in a practical manner rather than a dogmatic manner saying, look, Germany has done it and therefore you can do it. So that's the policy conversation at the macro level. Meso level, institutional capacity to localize SDGs. I have done SDGs for some of the states, and when you talk to people in the districts, and sometimes when you go to Gram Sabha meeting, I can assure you the entire SDG declaration seems like it's been written on some other planet because the language is too abstract. You try to explain reporting on intimate partner violence in a Gram Sabha meeting. No, it's not funny, but the fact is that you have to maintain the spirit and the content of the SDGs, but you have to do it within a local idiom. That's the most important thing. So that's what I meant, that at the meso level, you have to have the institutional capacity to localize SDGs, which currently is not invested. Right now, that forms and formats are being circulated based on the interagency expert group format for indicators tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. I can assure you all the forms and formats will be filled out, duly reported, nothing on the ground will be changed. So I think in India we need to build institutional capacity to localize SDGs so that people see themselves in the SDGs. And the third point is that we need to have accountability platforms. One of the good things about the HDRs, state HDRs, was since they were owned by the government, so they could be questioned in the state assembly saying, this is the situation in our state, what is it that you are doing about it? Therefore, that's why I used community and constituency, as accountability platforms. If we create these accountability platforms, then you will get political will. Political will doesn't happen in the abstract, it happens because there is public pressure. So I would say that if you are looking at human development translating more effectively into a sustainable development agenda, we need to have specific actions, macro with regard to national and state policy conversation, meso with regard to capacity building at various levels of governance, and certainly accountability platforms that make people demand SDGs as distinct from people in a nice United Nations setting. Thank you.
Okay, as chair, to get the most out of this session as possible, we have had two presentations, but foreshortened a discussion on the first presentation. So what I propose to do is to engage now in a dialogue on what Suraj has just presented, and then allow some time to come back if there's any more to be said about the experience with the Supreme Court cases and the trend and evolution, and perhaps some experience from students who have been on tribal lands and this sort of thing, and then move to Indranil, who will make the third presentation, followed by a discussion. Is that acceptable? David, can we proceed that way? So I'd like
What's
to...
your presentation on? Because we can find it. It's on financial protection and health insurance.
So it's separate, yeah, but it'll be related to this. So what I'd like you to do now is to pose questions that are related to what you've just heard, a very rich presentation from the experience of drafting state human development reports, and the impact that can have, and the problems that arise, as you concluded by discussing the difficulties at the macro, meso, and micro levels of translating objectives that, in this case, contrary to the MDGs, which India distanced itself from, the SDGs have been embraced. So, what are your thoughts? What are your questions? What are your experiences engaging with these issues? Do you understand this question about the interconnectedness of the SDGs when you have a nice little colorful wheel that is published in a document and so on, but at the local level it doesn't mean much. It's not going to change allocation of resources and decision making or engagement of the local population. So what does this all mean? Is that distance incapable of being bridged? Or are there means and methods that have been suggested in the presentation made by Suraj that suggest to you how India can accomplish more in moving from commitment to SDGs to changing people's lives? What thoughts do you have? Yes?
Put the mic on.
You'll be next. Go ahead, you first.
Not a thought, but just a question to Mr. Kumar. think state ownership or government ownership of the state human development goals deviated from the abstract concept of the SDGs as provided by the United Nations? I mean, I just want a few examples to throw some light on that.
Okay, no, I mean, the HDRs happened before the Sustainable Development Goals, so it's like a preface to it. But the advantage of all the time we spent, including being thrown out of chief secretaries' offices, okay, trying to explain to them the meaning and the value of the human development concept, which is about investing in things that improves people's lives and expand their choices, and not just going in for more and more investment in agriculture, industry and tertiary services. Human development in many ways, okay, the fact that money doesn't buy everything and so on and so forth is very easy to sort of convey. The point is that once you've conveyed it, what is the action the person to whom you've conveyed it, or the institution or the organization to whom you have conveyed that message, they are able to take. I think the index certainly helped, okay, because it's a bit of magic that you do, and people want to see how they do vis-a-vis the next state, and how does my district or my constituency do vis-a-vis the next constituencies, and so on and so forth. So having a vehicle for interstate and inter-district comparison, okay, it certainly grabs the attention of the policymaker. And please note, a bureaucrat is not a policy maker. Okay, a politician is the policy maker. The bureaucrat is someone who drafts. Okay, so certainly when the political leadership, okay, we did the first MP HDR, and I remember the first question that the Honorable Chief Minister asked when the report was shown to him, where is Rajgarh, which was his constituency. Unfortunately, because of typo, Rajgarh was written as Raigad, and there are 2 Raigads in Madhya Pradesh. So I can assure you the level of detail to which the political leadership is willing to go understand and act when it comes to seeing how something on which their performance can be judged is very, very good, much, much better than any bureaucrats. So therefore, I think the magic of the Human Development Index in terms of grabbing the attention of the political leadership was the first major factor. The second factor was, A, we did not use any international consultants, even though that made us very unpopular with HDRO, and that we managed to engage not just as grant makers but very systematically as fellow travelers in the journey of trying to understand what does human development mean with Karnataka. I remember Sudarshan helped Karnataka work out better understanding of district level poverty by suggesting that they pool the sample, and so on and so forth. So when they see sort of goodwill and knowledge on the other side, okay, it helps a lot. It helps a lot. And of course, the normative image of the United Nations is the third factor. So I hope that explains to you.
What do you mean by normative limits?
Yeah, I was.
Normative image, not limits.
Image, yeah.
The normative,
The image.
image,
Oh,
yeah, it's like,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, we're not the World Bank, okay, and so on and so forth. That helps a lot. It's much easier, okay, for a state government to incorporate, elements of human development in their budgets, because it comes from the United Nations, and we are not seen as, okay, fine, here is a sort of private sector or corporate agenda being rammed with the help of money.
Yes, but I can't resist chiming in here when one looks at the fact that India lobbied and successfully convinced the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank to grant $150 billion equity investment in the India Infrastructure Fund. Isn't that where the priorities are going? Rather than to human development and the concerns expressed in the state HDRs and so on?